excited to be here and honored to be able to talk to everybody today. And it's really, really nice to see so many faces from near and far, and to get a chance to think again about Pericles, which is a play I was saying to Julia yesterday. I every time I read it or see it, I think new things. I change my mind a lot about it. So I'm looking forward to thinking it through again and hearing your responses. I'm going to share my screen. So I hope that's working. That's small. Is that working? Is everybody seeing?
Yeah, we've got it. We're seeing your controls there at the bottom, but those might go away and they're not a hindrance in any case.
Okay, I don't know how to make them go away. Sorry. So thanks for inviting me, and thanks to the New Swan for putting Pericles on stage, and to the Shakespeare Center for hosting me today. I'm going to talk about Pericles, Prince of Tyre, which some of you might have seen at UCI's wonderful New Swan. How many of you actually have seen Beth Lope's gorgeous kind of evocative staging of this play? Can you maybe find your little Zoom hands in reactions there and raise your hands? I'm curious how many people have been able to see it. So a few, not a huge number. I highly recommend it. It's so good. It's really, really wonderful production. Has anyone seen other renditions of Pericles? Okay, maybe not so much. Okay, so it's a little known play, and I may do a little bit more summarizing than I ordinarily would, just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page. It's a gorgeous romance, as you may know. So it has a happy ending, but it's, as I'm going to sort of talk about today, its happy ending is precarious in ways that I think you'll start to see pretty quickly. I'm going to talk about Sanctuary, Shakespeare and Sanctuary, and in that context, I'm also going to talk about incest, father-daughter incest, which is the outrage that initiates the play's action. What is it to take sanctuary from a kind of perverse, ultra-confined form of sanctuary, the family cage of incest? Well, for one thing, sanctuary in this play is often in motion. As Julia Lupton has taught us and written about so beautifully, this is a play that is deeply concerned with spaces. Let me see. I want to get. Sorry, I'm having trouble moving my screen. Here we go. There we go. It's deeply concerned with spaces, different Mediterranean cities around which Apollonius travels. No, sorry, not Apollonius. That's his original name. Pericles in this play travels. Different ships that are tossed on the sea, different caskets, a brothel, different seashores, and of course the temple at Ephesus, which is the seat of the goddess Diana and the place where the play resolves. Pericles travels all over the Mediterranean, finding and losing and finding again his beloved wife and his daughter. The New Swan's production is brilliant in the way that it defines those spaces. Every space is different. There are men in suits in Tyre. There's a surf party in Pentapolis. There's a Western type border culture in Mytilene, where the brothel is, each with its associated costumes and lighting and music and physical attitudes, and yes, customs. The stage itself is continually transformed. It seems almost to get bigger and smaller, to expand and contract, depending where the action is set. what makes a space into a sanctuary? I'm going to ask you in a minute what comes to mind when you think about sanctuary and refuge. Shakespeare is deeply interested in how people seek and find sanctuary, in the spaces where that refuge is offered and found. He explores this concern from the plentiful forest of Arden, where the good Duke finds sanctuary with his merry men in As You Like It, to the hovel on the hovel on the heath in King Lear, where unaccommodated man seeks temporary and very meager shelter. But sanctuary is also a human concern, a general idea, or even an ideal that humans tend to share across time periods, across the globe, and across cultures. So I'm going to stop my sharing for a second and just ask you, when you think of sanctuary, and I mean this in a very general way, when you think of sanctuary, what comes to mind? What is sanctuary, not just in Shakespeare, but nowadays or at any time? What is it associated with, would you say? What comes to mind for you? And you can, of course, unmute and tell us what your thoughts are. Deanna?
I'm sorry, I was just trying to turn on my microphone.
That's all good.
I didn't have, sorry, my hand was up before to say it seemed to play, but I'll answer your question anyway.
Oh, okay, that's great.
And I'll just say that actually the first thing that comes to my mind is sort of the etymology of the word, which relates it to a sacred space, a space of holy objects and of holy protection, which presumably becomes a space of what we think of as sanctuary, a safe space. But I think, first of all, of the place where saints' bones may be kept, or where that lies behind an altar, say in a church.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you. And I'm seeing some other things in the chat too. That's sanctity, holy protection, saints' bones, a place to keep things, a kind of archive, maybe a place for shrines, a religious institution that provides safety and shelter. When they go there, they have to take you in, Vivian. Yes, exactly. There's a kind of compelled safety to that. Temporal laws, yes, immunity from temporal laws, sacred spaces that let you kind of off the hook. And I'll talk about that even more in a minute. Other things that come to people's minds, yes, sanctuary cities, thank you. So nowadays, it's become a kind of politicized term. And even in Shakespeare's time, as I'll talk about briefly, it is politicized in some slightly different ways. But immigrants finding asylum is what it has come to kind of refer to the most powerfully these days. And yeah, Jack, thank you. Background danger, making sanctuary and safety a necessity because you're taking sanctuary from something, right? Refuge in a storm, spaces set off from something that is more, either more profane or more dangerous. That's great, thank you. So we have a kind of now a working definition of sanctuary. A refuge, a place to flee to, a safe place, a sacred place, a space that's set off from the ordinary, that takes you away from prosecution, perhaps. It's a space where things that are normal are suspended or put on hold. Time might be different, might be urgently speedy as you flee to sanctuary, or very slow as you wait in sanctuary. And notice how we got to language about conflict, political argument, danger. Safe space is always in relation to what's outside or around it, what's on the other side of the sanctuary walls. And the boundary between safe space and dangerous space is something that people often cross, from people going into the church, say, or coming out of the church, to immigrants crossing borders, seeking asylum. People flee into sanctuary and they are sometimes dragged out of it. And yet, precisely because someone might always come pull you out, sanctuary can be confining. It can trap you, fearful or bored inside a church or a cave, or think of Anne Frank and her family during the Second World War in an attic. This kind of sanctuary can divide you from your former life and friends, your social world, your political community. It can isolate and imprison you. A beneficial sanctuary starts to look like much more than just a quiet refuge or a safe place to house what's precious. It needs to be porous. Even it needs to be contested. Creative things need to happen there. Otherwise, it's imprisoning. It's too enclosed. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here again. Oops. There we go. Just last weekend, there was a headline in the New York Times, a surge in migrants. Now it's been changed, actually. I don't know why, but it's been changed to a migrant wave. Tests New York City's identity as a global sanctuary. That's a very typical sanctuary headline. New York City is understood as a sanctuary for people who are moving, for migrants across the globe. The sheer numbers, recently people who are being bussed north by Texas Governor Greg Abbott, are testing the sanctuary's capacity. Its borders are being crossed, its space is being stretched, its very identity as a civic entity, a community, is being called into question. That headline makes the streets of New York sound so unenclosed, so porous. A surge or wave is like water flooding in unimpeded. Because of this sense of excess in the present day United States, and not just here, we often try to define sanctuaries' limits, a wall or a numerical limit or an ethical limit, like you can seek asylum from war, but not for economic reasons. All these limits or conditions produce tests or contestations. People live undocumented or even live in sanctuary for months or years in a state of waiting while these conflicts play out, or they live in detention. Even territorially, we run into contestations. When does a sanctuary city get to exert its jurisdiction as against the jurisdictional claim of the state or federal entities? How many people can the US let in, and from where, and for what reasons? What are these moving people going to do to the place once they're in? Are they an economic threat, a moral threat, a legal threat, or are they productive? Do they contribute to society? A phrase in quotation marks. Such contestations may be polarizing, but they keep sanctuary and asylum available and open for discussion. In the present day, these questions are asked in a context where sanctuary is not articulated within the law. By contrast, in the Middle Ages and into Shakespeare's time, sanctuary was a routine legal procedure. Under the common law, people who were accused of felonies could flee to the nearest church and take refuge there from prosecution for up to 40 days. Sometimes they would come out and stand trial, but more often they would confess their crime to the coroner, the king's official, give up all their belongings and abjure, that is, swear to leave the realm, not just the room, and live in exile. Sanctuary seekers would make their way to the nearest port where they had to set sail, usually to France, as soon as possible, never to return. Later, variations on this law developed, and there were larger cathedrals and monasteries like Westminster Abbey, where people could register and live for indefinite periods if they had means. Some people began to be exiled within the realm, sent to sanctuary towns like Beverly or Durham, or sent to Scotland and Ireland. Generally, sanctuary was a temporary shelter, a suspension of prosecution until another solution was found. The principle of such sanctuary, whatever form it took, and however contested its terms, the principle was survival. Instead of trial and in general execution, the felon could stay alive. This can be seen as incredibly cold comfort. Sanctuary seekers who abjured the realm, that is, went into exile, were often very poor. And after they landed in France with nothing, they were even more desperate than before. Yet survival itself matters, even in a state of utter loss, vulnerability, and need. Only decades before Shakespeare and Wilkins worked on Pericles, there was a sudden, enormous loss of sanctuary space. Most of the church spaces where sanctuary had long been sought, the cathedrals, monasteries, and even chapels where people had formerly fled in desperation, these were destroyed by Henry VIII in the 1530s and 40s. According to exhaustive research done recently by Shannon McSheffrey, sanctuary thus diminished in Shakespeare's era, not because Protestants had any grand religious problem with it, not because it was outdated and connected to medieval superstition, but rather because the spaces for it were destroyed or repurposed. Spaces are so crucial to the way we understand our inhabitation of the world. They enable certain styles and attitudes. They circumscribe our ideas about what kind of action is possible.
What are we looking for?
The walls or shores around us make us who we are. Shakespeare was writing in a time when sacred spaces had been destroyed and the religious and legal culture that depended upon them was changing. But sanctuary seeking was still on the books and was still occasionally practiced. And as we know from our current moment, the idea of sanctuary has never really gone away. In fact, for Shakespeare, sanctuary as an idea might have been even more charged with fascination in an era of ruins, when obvious sanctuary spaces had carriages driving through them or were left open to the elements. In Shakespeare and Wilkins's Pericles, the most obvious sacred space is the Temple of Diana at Ephesus, where the play ends. How does the scene at Ephesus contribute to our understanding of sanctuary's significance for Shakespeare? I'm not going to talk first about the end, but about Tyre, the mother's arrival. So Pericles' wife, he marries, and then rapidly he loses her. She apparently dies in childbirth, and has to be sent overboard from the ship that she dies in. It's at how does this scene? So then she washes up on the shore of Ephesus, and it's at Ephesus that her casket then is opened, and she comes back to life, as I'll describe. It's at Ephesus that Sacramental the doctor cares for the apparently dead Tyre after her caulked and bitumed casket washes up on the shore. The casket is a contained space, itself like a sanctuary. Its careful construction enables her survival. She washes up under the aegis of Diana, the ancient goddess whose huge temple on the shores of the city had, by Shakespeare's time, long been ruined. I'll get to that temple in a minute. Tyre is a treasure, protected within, though her survival also depends on her casket being opened. Here is Sacramental's speech when she is waking. Behold, her eyelids, cases to those heavenly jewels which Pericles hath lost, begin to part their fringes of bright gold. The diamonds of a most praised water doth appear to make the world twice rich. Live, and make us weep to hear your fate, fair creature, rare as you seem to be. Sacramental, who has miraculously brought her back to life, is describing the opening of Tyre's eyes, and he does so in terms that echo her containment and inside the casket, her encasement, as it were, her eyelids with their fringes of bright gold, her lashes, are the containers or cases for the heavenly jewels of her eyes. It's an image that paints a very intimate, focused picture of the life coming back within her body. Thaisa's body itself resembles a casket or a coffer, a box for the dead, but also a container that has protected her spirit. It's like a Russian doll, eyes within lids, within a body, within a casket, all bejeweled, washing ashore. Even with this emphasis on containers, Thaisa's body is in a liminal space, a threshold space, in between the adventurous living she's been doing so far, falling in love and marrying, and traveling and giving birth, and the cessation of such adventure in the stillness of death. The lids around her eyes are both shrouds for her death, and as she wakes, frames for her life. This liminal or suspended state extends through the rest of the play. Saruman, the doctor, tells her when she awakens, Diana's temple is not far, where till your date expire, where till your date expire, you may abide. That is, until you die, you can live there. She will wait, she will abide, or bide her time, anticipating death, even though she has so wondrously and narrowly escaped it. We won't see Thaisa again until the end of the play, but her sanctuary at Ephesus is where Diana, in a dream, bids Pericles to go after he has found his daughter. It is where Pericles discovers Thaisa alive and asks her, he says, to be buried a second time within these arms. The temple is the site of a miracle of rediscovery, but that language, buried a second time, keeps it remarkably close to death. This is modern day Ephesus. The ruin of Diana's temple no longer lies near the water, actually, though in this picture there's an echo of its former grandeur and its former proximity to the sea. I think that water there is very shallow. In fact, by Shakespeare's time, the harbor had already silted up, and the sea nowadays is 4 kilometers away. Thaisa's Ephesus is still a port city. The play is set in late antiquity. It's still a port city and retains the Temple of Diana, one of the 7 wonders of that ancient world. And yet the ruin here in this photo is evocative, like the ruins of the medieval monasteries I showed you earlier. Surviving in sanctuary doesn't mean you stay still inside a caulked and bitumed casket. It is instead a survival inside the ruined walls, a liminal and temporary state, abiding of time, a condition where you are alive in a state of waiting, only a hair's breadth or an eyelash away from death. Yet the temple at Ephesus, associated with the ancient matriarchal cult of Diana, is also a sacred space, a kind of sacred library or archive of precious ancient lore. I like having the water in this picture because in Shakespeare's passage, the passage I just showed you, water is a fascinating word. I'm going to go back to it just for a second. The diamonds of a most praised water. It has to do with assessing gemstones here. The 3 highest grades of quality in diamonds were known as the first water, second water, and third water. Thaisa's eyes are of the highest quality, diamonds of a most praised water, a quality that suggests high rank and goodness and the sheer preciousness of her life, as well as richness. She's a treasure kept safe from the storm. Yet the watery chaos of Thaisa's arrival at Ephesus is also there in the language, as though her own eyes retain such chaos within them. Water is both the thing that endangered her and the sign of her protection. Water in the Bible, in the biblical book of Genesis, is also where God first created life, blowing his breath or spirit across the waters. Perhaps, too, the calmer water of baptism lurks in the background here, as though Thaisa's own tears were washing her clean and cleansing all those around her who are weeping for her fate. Live, says Saruman, and make us weep to hear your fate, fair creature, rare as you seem to be. Survival might look like it's cold comfort, but the survival offered by Thaisa's little sanctuary is also precious. The compassion of Saruman and his attendants invites Thaisa into a community. Their tears like the water of baptism, the Christian rite of community membership. For Saruman, her life is precious because she suffers and evokes sympathy. A Christian sacramental reading chimes with some of the other imagery surrounding her revival. Her bodily enclosure suggests the Virgin Mary, tabernacle of Jesus. A tabernacle is a shrine or sanctuary, a sacred space protected as a space of God. In this shrine of the Virgin, you can see the enclosure of Jesus within Mary. And what this means is not just that Jesus, the baby, is protected in her womb, but also more evident here, Jesus, the Savior, resides there too. The tiny shrine becomes a place of birth and magnificent salvation. It's as though the Russian dolls containing their tiny inner treasures expand to make the sanctuary of Mary's body into a whole saved world. Remember, I said that I loved how the New Swan production of Pericles makes spaces contract and expand. There is a wonderful moment after Thaisa dies aboard ship when her coffin is tossed on the waves. And in this production, the actress playing the goddess Diana holds a small jewel box to represent Thaisa's casket, moving her on the water around the stage. The staging shrinks Thaisa in her vulnerability, but it also magnifies her human story, giving it the sense of fated or patterned narrative, a plot presided over by the ancient goddess. This contraction of the casket and expansion of the scope of travel adds to the significance of Thaisa's movement across the sea, which is world-changing. When Thaisa awakes, she asks, "What world is this?" Diana, holding Thaisa in sanctuary, enables this movement into a whole new world where others weeping for her suffering help her survive. There is other imagery connecting Thaisa to the sacred and making her sanctuary creative and productive. Her coffin washes up smelling sweetly, suggesting an odor of sanctity. That is the smell associated with saints' legends and miracles. Her revival, too, hints at Christ's resurrection itself. The language of treasure and riches even contributes to such an association, as the vocabulary of Christian salvation is often monetary. Think, for example, about the word redemption, which is also what you do with coupons, or think of the treasure of heaven that Jesus teaches his followers to value in the Gospel of Matthew. Thaisa, an earthly and spiritual treasure, will end up in the convent of Diana, precious, harbored in sanctuary, a safe and sacred space of devotion. It is a space where time stretches out and she abides under Diana's ancient sacred presence, under her aegis, her protection. But safe from what? This sanctuary at the Temple of Diana is also puzzling. Thaisa has been given a refuge from the storm at sea and from the pain of childbirth. Presumably, if this were a different story, she might go off in her own ship looking for Pericles now. But as with any sanctuary, there remains a question of why she might need such a refuge, what she is taking sanctuary from. When she revives, she concludes rather quickly that she will never find Pericles again, despite knowing his name and the city he comes from. Does she need refuge from him? Perhaps from the oddly contagious taint of incest that was what he was fleeing? He certainly seeks refuge from incest, not only from its initial appearance in the kingdom of Antioch and the incestuous king Antiochus himself, but from the hints of father-daughter incest that continue to rise up throughout the play. He has to give away his infant daughter into others' care, into a supposed sanctuary at Tarsus, because otherwise he would be alone with her. Implicitly, the threat of incest lingers. Another hint of incest is actually the language of enclosed spaces. that echoes across the play from Wilkins's initial half through Shakespeare's second half. These spaces tend to oscillate between safety and imprisonment, between sanctuary and incest, between sacred enclosure and bodily danger. Tarsus goes from a sanctuary for the baby to a site of attempted murder when her adoptive parents try to kill her off. Mitylene's entrapping brothel is in a sense transformed into a school when Marina, who is taken, the daughter, who is taken to this brothel by some crazy plot twists, taken to this brothel, instead convinces everyone she is supposed to sleep with to leave her alone, and ends up in opening her own school. From the beginning, Antiochus's daughter, so the victim of the incest, is a figure enclosed, and this is in the first scene of the play. She is called a glorious casket stored with ill, anticipating Thaisa's literal casket. Pericles reads Antiochus's riddle, the riddle that everyone has to resolve in order to win supposedly his daughter's hand in marriage. So he tells this riddle, and Pericles figures it out immediately and tells the king that whoever can read king's deeds is more secure to keep it shut than shown. So he keeps his own answer to this riddle, the answer to which is incest. He keeps that answer, Pericles keeps that answer closed. He won't say what the answer is. In the new Swan production, the daughter is enclosed in a cage-like garment encircled by her father. These images imply the secrecy and isolation and stasis that often attends incest. There is a group of such tales that circulated in the Middle Ages, including a series of romances with female heroines. One of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the Man of Law's Tale, falls into this category, and the late classical story Apollonius of Tyre, which is the retold story, is retold by the medieval poet John Gower and then by Wilkins and Shakespeare. It is this story that Shakespeare and Wilkins make into Pericles. It's this same Gower, too, who comes back to life on stage to narrate this play. I'll get to him at the end. The trouble with sanctuary is that it can, in fact, resemble that secret space that hides the ancient horror of incest. Incest is taboo, transgressive, violent, but the play, like its medieval forebears, is deeply concerned with it. Why? What does incest mean symbolically? How is its contagion so powerful that even after Antiochus himself is dead of a thunderbolt, the play cannot yet send Pericles home, cannot let Thaisa wander free, and still has to act out the daughter Marina's sexual resistance? There are a few different answers to these questions. One significance of incest surely has to do with the loss or absence of the queen, conventionally the king's closest counselor, so that the sole power of the state resides in him, apparently unchecked. The king is the sole power alone with his daughter. Incestuous violence then becomes associated with tyranny. He thinks his role means he thinks that his role is to impose his own will, his absolute power, regardless of counsel or resistance, upon subjects, especially his more intimate subject, his daughter. He further fails to distinguish private desire from public or political power, so that what is supposed to be a sanctum, the family, is contaminated by his exercise of royal will. The incestuous king, then, is the ultimate invader of sanctuary. And yet, paradoxically, in a sense, this violation allows him to carry out a perverse fantasy of sanctuary. The incestuous king doesn't have to accept any husband from outside or distribute his wealth anywhere but within his own family to his own daughter. He's keeping all his treasure safe and close in the family, as it were. He achieves a kind of dynastic stasis a perverse familial and political stability. In one of the medieval incest romances that I have in mind, called Aimare, the daughter refuses the advances of her father, Artius, and he casts her off in a rudderless boat with no food or drink and nothing but a magical embroidered jeweled robe. Thrown up on several shores, Aimare uses the robe both as a hiding place and as an identifying talisman. Like Thaisa, she is rescued by men who notice her by her bright container, her cloth, and recognize her stature and her strength by the jewels that enclose her. She is a liminal figure, an outcast, traveling from shore to shore in the portable sanctuary of her magic robe. Only when she has married and had a son can she be reunited with a contrite Artius and go home. Marrying and having children who can inherit, provides a more open, more porous, and more tenable form of familial sanctuary, a refuge both from, and in this case, for the tyrannical father. So then what does it mean to seek sanctuary from the enclosing force of incest? Sanctuary is starting to look like it needs to be more open and porous and temporary, more in motion than we might have expected. When closed, it starts to look imprisoning and incestuous. Pericles flees from the incestuous king and his daughter, the contaminated jewel box. He flees from that perverse form of sanctuary and is then in motion and unhoused for much of the play, kind of like Aimare actually, as if seeking sanctuary at every port, but always unable to stay. More than this, he is in flight. He continually flees from anything that has a whiff of incest. For example, Thaisa's father. Now, Simonides is explicitly not an incestuous king, and his court seems at first to harbor the washed up Pericles with a kind of miraculous benevolence. In the New Swan production, Pentapolis is staged as a kind of outrageously joyous beach party, a land of perpetual spring break, presided over by the glad-handing king in his playful pink jacket. He has invited suitors to compete for his daughter's hand, which is something Antiochus does too. But Simonides doesn't put the suitors to death if they lose, nor does he pose a riddle or a problem for the suitors to solve. He just invites them to show themselves and their heraldry in a pageant before himself and his daughter. His real purpose is to marry his daughter to an appropriate husband, not to keep her for himself. And eventually he will marry her to Pericles. And yet Simonides is played by the same actor as Antiochus in this production. It's a smart move. Simonides plays a strangely intimate part in his daughter's decision-making, sending Thaisa to greet Pericles despite her coy resistance, urging the two of them to dance, stopping them from dancing, and most notably, pretending to be against the marriage when he's all for it. Remember that scene where he calls Pericles a traitor for bewitching his child. Those of you who have seen the play or read the play will remember this. And poor Pericles, suffering a kind of post-Antioch PTSD, thinks his life is in danger. He says, "It's the king's subtlety to have my life." Simonides is just joking around, though, play acting the tyrannical and overprotective father. Pericles does not find incest here. He finds a daughter who can be given to him and a father who enables that marriage. The scene concludes with Simonides speaking a couplet that links up the father's approval, the wedding, and a hint of their having future children. "It pleaseth me so well that I will see you wed, then with what haste you can, get you to bed." That incestuous dynastic fantasy, not what's going to happen here. And yet still, a sense of resolution is a little tempered if we listen closely. Get you to bed? Is Simonides imagining his daughter's sex life here? Perhaps because incest is still too close in the arc of the play, the sanctuary of Pentapolis and the sanctuary of Pericles and Thaisa's marriage are achingly temporary. While Thaisa bides her time at Ephesus, Pericles struggles from place to place, believing his wife dead and eventually believing his daughter murdered. In his profound grief, neither dead nor fully alive, moving across the sea but closed up in the ship's hold, he exists in a kind of suspended state, a liminal zone of his own. In his case, it is a sanctuary that is too tightly closed, perhaps even now too much like the closed chamber of the initial incest scene. Pericles recedes from light and speech. He even seems to recede from time's passage, suspended in the space of his own loss. It is Marina's fierce and express will, her autonomy, that breaks the hold of incest on this family's romance. For Marina does live, albeit as a migrant subject to abduction and sex trafficking. There is first the attempted murder, and then in the middle of her resisting that murder, pirates arrive on shore and carry her off and sell her into the brothel. This is a series of potential and actual violations, each of which resembles a component of that initial incestuous violation. Antiochus kills off his daughter's autonomy, abducts her for himself, forces himself upon her, and she is silent and unnamed. Marina, like her, isn't provided with a spatial sanctuary from attempted murder, abduction, and again, sexual violation. But unlike her, Marina makes sanctuaries. That said, the New Swan production is careful not to blame the daughter of Antiochus for failing to make a sanctuary for herself. The play's phrase, bad daughter, which is what Wilkins's language says about her, is changed to bad man, and she survives in this production to rule in Antioch after her incestuous father dies. But Marina, Pericles' child, is different from her. Marina's active building project is finally the best antidote to incest's dark enclosure. Indeed, she remakes continually the space around her. The governor of Mytilene, Lysimachus, comes to her at the brothel and declares, "The house you dwell in proclaims you to be a creature of sale." So this governor is in disguise and wants to pay for sex. He comes to her and assumes that she will acquiesce, but she insists she is not for sale. She calls into question the nature of the place. She further remakes him, insisting that a good governor cannot possibly intend to acquiesce to the space and violate her. Eventually, she will erect a school for girls, as I said, in a leafy shelter beside the sea. By the time she is finished with Lysimachus, he redefines his own intentions and her identity by redefining the brothel's space. "Be you thoughten that I came with no ill intent, for to me the very doors and windows savor vilely. They taste bad now. Fare thee well, thou art a piece of virtue." He says essentially, go ahead and think I didn't come here with sex in mind, because now this place grosses me out. Changing the space makes me see how you look completely different, a piece of virtue rather than a prostitute. And he hightails it out of there. It's interesting that it's the doors and windows, the threshold markers, the openings, that Lysimachus now sees as essential markers of the brothel, not the private place that he had earlier asked Marina to take him to. She calls the brothel a sty and a place of such resort, but the space has become more porous, more changeable, more of a created thing, and the instrument of that creativity is more and more Marina's language. The climactic and incredibly moving recognition scene. where Marina is sent to comfort the silent Pericles in the hold of his ship, is in a sense a sanctuary scene itself. But it is dark and, as it turns out, violent. Here we see Pericles in his liminal state, his dark version of Thais' abiding, grieving, catatonic, near death but not dead. This is what his suspended flight from incest looks like. Pericles has been at sea and in motion, but closed in and static. It is a situation of miserable survival, even overliving, having lost all. It is a scene of him in retreat, refusing to move forward, regressive and wombed. That is why when Marina breaks in upon his silence, there is a hint of the incest that colors the entire plot. She's alone with him. And in the written editions of the play, though not in the Swan production, he strikes her when she gets too close. That blow is in Gower's version and in all the earlier sources that I know. Once he realizes who she is, his language contains another hint of incest. He calls her, "Thou that begetst him that doth thee beget," you who give life to the very Father who gave life to you, in a metaphorical version of a classic incest riddle. The recognition scene raises the specter of incest so strongly, in fact, that the play immediately marries Marina off to Lysimachus, as if to avoid any possibility of wrongdoing. Marina's presence, both her body and her language, nonetheless prompt Pericles into a spatial redescription. He returns to the vocabulary of the jeweled casket that we have seen before. I am great with woe and shall deliver weeping. My dearest wife was like this maid, and such a one my daughter might have been. My queen's square brows, her stature to an inch, as wand-like straight, as silver-voiced, her eyes as jewel-like and cased as richly. In pace another Juno, who starves the ears she feeds and makes them hungry the more she gives them speech. Pericles' description of Marina calls to mind the scene of Thais' resurrection, her jeweled eyes encased by golden lashes. Her presence resurrects Thais in Pericles' memory and brings back his daughter, who such a one might have been. The effect is to open what's been closed. He speaks after having been mute, and he redefines his confinement as pregnancy. I am great with woe and shall bring forth weeping. He admits into his own language, just barely, the possibility that he will not simply give birth to weeping, but give birth to something else while weeping. Marina, meanwhile, takes on a kind of architectural presence, not dissimilar to the statue of the Virgin Mary we looked at earlier, housing the savior of the world in her jeweled sanctum. As he coaxes her to tell her story, Pericles compares her to a palace. Yeah, this is right. Prithee, speak. Falseness cannot come from thee, for thou lookest modest as justice, and thou seemest a palace for the crowned truth to dwell in. I will believe thee. Marina is an allegorical figure here for modesty and truth and justice, like a sculpture or a statue. In Pericles' Sea of Troubles, she seems to represent a stable, true story, a solid thing. An older meaning of truth tells us even more. Truth as loyalty, as social bond, as promise. You can think of the archaism plighting one's troth as an example of this. In Marina, even before he knows her identity, Pericles sees a container of truth, a space of virtue and reliability, a human connection, and thus a counter to the riddle he never fully answered. Paradoxically, she represents sanctuary from the isolated hold where he has retreated. She comes into the space, she crosses a boundary, she opens it up. She makes his grief permeable to her influence and her comfort, and this is the sanctuary. The space rendered porous and ever shifting. In this sense, Marina stands as the polar opposite of the enclosed Antiochian casket. She is open, active, talkative. This place is relational. What were thy friends? Pericles demands. He is asking her to recreate herself within a context, to tell her story to an audience, to make herself more than herself, to sculpt her own statue for him right there before him. Sculptures of truth are almost always women, like this neo-Gothic one carved over the door of the coroner's office in Manchester, England. It's no accident that she is at the gateway over the portal. It's as if she is a threshold spirit watching over the office. Also, like Marina, she's both within the building, in the palace of truth, as it were, and outside it, housing that truth and showing it to others. When Pericles asks who Marina's parents were, he urges her to open her griefs as though opening a casket or a door. I think thou saidst, thy griefs might equal mine if both were opened. This sculpture has an opened cloak or cowl open above her head, an image of revealed truth. She has a mirror in her hand, suggesting the self-reflexiveness, the element of truth that has to do with honesty and self-knowledge. Pericles is saying to Marina, both, show me the truth about yourself and show me a mirror of myself. And also, finally, show me how we are related, how your griefs equal mine, how we constitute a community or a family. Remember Sacramental asking to hear Thaisa's story and saying that that too would be the basis of community. Make us weep to hear your fate, fair creature, he says. It's remarkable how carefully and slowly the play unwinds the tendrils of incest here, how tightly those tendrils cling to the language of the play's ending, and how subtle a distinction there is between the play's idea of sanctuary and such absolute enclosure. In this sense, the play is profoundly backward-looking, recursive, insistent on rehearsing that initial trauma and contamination. Marina tells her history, her past here. In part, Marina's authority, her voice, her skill, her capacity to retell stories and reconceive spaces. This is what allows the recognition scene to avoid the recursive, backward-looking confinement of incestuous kingship. Her life story allows Pericles to be reborn or rebegotten, literally and figuratively, to emerge into the light and become once again a king. But still, the story's past contains both incest and sanctuary, both transgression and restoration. Earlier in the play, Pericles, cast on the shores of Pentapolis, finds rusted armor on the shore. It turns out to be his father's, lost in the wreck at sea. Under its aegis, its protection, aegis literally means shield. He goes to court and wins Thaisa. Such armor signals an ancient deteriorated glory, but it also shows Pericles' resourcefulness. It shows how he can adapt the past to his present need. The play itself adapts something old to present need. It's a medieval romance. It's an old song sung for restoratives, as the narrator Gower tells us at the very beginning. The medicines that restore Thaisa, the fresh clothes and music that comfort Pericles, these link back to the restoratives of the story itself, a story from the past that is restored on the stage. This brings us at last to that odd figure, John Gower, restored on stage, risen from the ashes at the beginning, to explain and move the plot along. Sometimes in the New Swans production, Gower gives aid to those on stage. The same actor, Greg Unger, even plays Saruman, the doctor who revives Thaisa. But even as Saruman, he stands in the gaps to teach you the stages of our story, as he tells us. There he is on the stairs or up above the action, marginal to the space. He talks the whole way through. He is reminding us who people are and where spatially they are going, which stage they are playing on. Stage might be a spatial and a temporal designation. He's telling us what stage or phase of things we're seeing, which episode in the sequence of crazy events that make up our story. But he seems to be peripheral, marginal, divided from the action, a figment of the past that is also the origin of the story. We might linger on that word, episode. This play is dizzyingly episodic. It moves from one mini plot to another, often changing the whole cast of characters in the process, and in a sense, changing worlds each time Pericles or Thaisa or Marina lands on a new shore. Watching it is a little like binge watching the family drama of Prince Pericles. Etymologically, episode refers to something that comes in from the side, from epi, an addition, plus isodos, a coming in, an entrance. So each new episode comes in from the side, like it's coming in from left field. We may find ourselves disoriented, wondering how this stage relates to the previous one and the one that comes after. We may have the sensation of moving sideways through the plot. We may have the sensation of repetition rather than progress. Gower tells us where we are. He centers us, even as he himself is always to the side of things, at the edges, kind of like a moving borderline or a frame around a picture that you keep moving so the picture itself will shift. What is Gower doing here? We could say more, but he's here in part to remind us of the play's artificiality, its madeness, the way in which it fantasizes a new frame for old ideas, a new restoration of Pericles' family dynasty out of an incest and 2 deaths. In that sense, Gower is like the statue of truth up on the coroner's office in Manchester, presiding over the boundaries of the sanctuary, which not accidentally houses the officer of death. The play, with its gorgeous recognition scene and romance happy ending, offers us a kind of sanctuary from its own horrible disturbances. Performed in the lovely but impermanent New Swan, this year's Pericles emphasizes all the more the play's vulnerable characters who stumble and suffer so close to the audience, aided by such simple scenery, the billowing waves and waters of the set. The stage is itself a perfect image for the kind of sanctuary I've been trying to talk about today. It is lovely and creative. It looks here like a jewel box. It is enclosed, but open to the weather, letting in wind through the colored slats. It lets its audiences escape for a couple of hours, the dangers of pandemic and the polarizing divisions in American political life. But it reminds us too of the terrible vulnerability of migrants in our world. Maybe afterwards we emerge and ask ourselves, what world is this? Maybe we know from this sanctuary that sanctuary itself is never permanent, never closed, and never wholly safe, but that for all its porousness and contestation, it's a space and time, a fantasy, a story, a suspended and even dangerous liminal zone that serves a human need. Thanks.
Wow, beautiful.
Motivation.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I am going to take you off of the spotlight, and if people are on gallery view, they can thank Elizabeth for, just a really so beautiful, deep, and comprehensive account of this play, whose episodic quality does have a kind of a rhythm and a logic to it, which you've kind of beautifully expounded for us. I know that some people will have to leave at the hour, but I know that Elizabeth will stay and answer some questions and comments. So I know Eli was here. If Eli wants to comment from the artistic director's point of view, or if anyone else wants to make a comment, that would be great.
It looks like Eli needed to go.
Yeah, I
so-
think he had to go get the theater going tonight. We do have a production of comedy.
Fair enough.
But thank you for that. That was really beautiful.
Thanks.
I know we have various people who studied this play with me this weekend for Shakespeare's Weekend. We also do have a medievalist here present.
And some specialists in early modern
Just a little bit.
things. Yeah, do people know
Vivian, is your
Westerns or
hand
not?
up? And you might have to unmute, Viv.
Well, just in passing, just thank you for giving me this reading of Pericles, which I saw in Pasadena with Ken and Julia some years ago with Bob. And one of the scenes that I remember from that production and that echo that was reborn differently in this one was Marina as teaching.
Mhm.
And I thought that was an extension of her into the play that gave me hope for her at the end.
Mm.
And I was moved by the last lines of Gower that you read aloud, saying, teach. Because it's not preachy, that play, but
Yeah.
I loved it. Anyway, thank you for teaching something.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you. Thank you, Vivian. Looks like Eve has a comment as well. Eve was here for Shakespeare Weekend.
Hi, and thank you so much. That was just fabulous. The title of your presentation was Sanctuary and Shakespeare, or Shakespeare and Sanctuary. And I was especially thinking of Romeo fleeing to Padua
Mm.
for Sanctuary. I haven't done this cross graph of who went where for Sanctuary, but how big a social and political issue was it in Shakespeare's day, and how cognizant would he have been of acknowledging that and using it with the audience's emotional investment in sanctuary issues?
Yeah. Well, I think he would have been highly cognizant of its recent history as a legal procedure. It was pretty common before the dissolution of the monasteries, and it continued. In fact, there was a wave of sanctuary seeking during Mary's reign, in part because of the sort of redefinition of sacred space, because she was Catholic. So there are ongoing references to sanctuary, ongoing legal contestations about it. And the other thing is, Shakespeare is so often writing about a past where sanctuary is very live. There's, of course, that Romeo and Juliet sanctuary kind of doesn't work, right? It has a tragic completion. And the same is often true for sanctuaries in the tragedies, whereas in the comedies and romances, sanctuary tends to actually work. Like The Forest of Arden actually kind of works as a safe place for the good Duke to hang out until everything can be resolved and he can be put back on the throne. So there are, I think, some resonances between the kind of legal history that for Shakespeare would have been past and the play's ways of working out sanctuary and safe places. So I think he was very aware of this, actually.
Beautiful. Thank you, Elizabeth. Then incoming English major Jessica Rosenau, who's been coming to the New Swan for years,
Hi,
chose UCI over UCLA because of the New Swan. Jessica.
Thanks for the introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so first and foremost, thank you, Elizabeth Allen, for the wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. And as you were presenting, I was thinking that obviously Pericles flees to Tarsus for sanctuary from Antiochus, but he also gives Cleon and Dionysa, their kingdom, food, because they're in a famine.
Mhm.
And I was wondering, would that be a form of sanctuary or just him saying thank you for the sanctuary? Because he is a person, he can't really be a sanctuary.
No, I mean, I don't know if he's exactly a sanctuary, no, but I think he does. I think that's stretching the term to call Tarsus a sanctuary. You notice I didn't really address Tarsus that much in this talk because it is a much more kind of balanced political trade there that he makes. And in fact, in the original, they put up a statue in his honor. I can't remember whether they do in Pericles too, but they put up a statue in his honor. When he revisits that statue, he also visits the tomb of Marina that links him to her. So there's a much more kind of solid political presence of both Pericles and Marina at Tarsus. So that, you know, calling that a sanctuary, I might be playing a little bit metaphorical with that term. In that case, so it's interesting. He has a lot more political wherewithal at the beginning of the play there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And we have comments from Chris, from Marilyn, and also from Jack Miles. So I'm going to ask each of you to ask your questions since we're running out of time, and then Elizabeth can kind of respond to the set of those. So Chris?
Elizabeth, take notes on all our questions, I guess. So I was struck by your comment earlier. I came in late, but the first king, whose name I can't remember.
Antiochus.
Yeah, thank you. With the daughter, and there's this incestuous relationship, and you remark on the trouble he has marking the boundary between private and public, which sounds awfully familiar today. There are plenty of people who have trouble distinguishing between themselves and the state. But this problem is compounded since the royal family is the state, right? So there's really, legally, in some sense, not really a distinction between private and public in the kind of way that we understand it in this democracy.